can global other countries be inspired by what China is doing or how China is doing things? Like you're saying, it's a different model. The fact that you've got all these state-owned companies in China means that this is basic. It's basically China's way of subsidizing. It doesn't sound like a subsidy if you tell a state-owned company you must build at least 100 megawatts of electrolyzers, at least 100 kilometers of pipelines, etc. But it really is a subsidy because the state-owned company is going to build it. They might lose money on it, but they know that they're not going to go bust because the state will save them if the need arises. Whereas that's not necessarily the case with most of the other developers in most of the other countries where they have to justify spending to their shareholders and meet their internal rates of return, etc., which makes it much harder to make large investments like that.
Let's Talk Hydrogen, the podcast from H2 Hub. We bring the most exciting minds from the world of hydrogen and molecules to the microphone and talk about innovations, trends, and opportunities.
Welcome to a new episode of Let's Talk Hydrogen. Today we talk about trends and challenges for hydrogen innovation in 2026. Where does the market really stand? Which expectations are holding up? Which narratives are starting to crack? And where new opportunities open new perspectives for hydrogen? I'm Uwe Kerkmann, CEO of H2 Hub, and my guest today is Martin Tengler, Head of Hydrogen at BloombergNEF, one of the world's leading research institutes for energy transition and energy economics. Martin and his team analyze hydrogen projects, policies, and investments worldwide, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Martin, great to have you with us.
Hi, Uwe. Thank you.
So, Martin, you are a keen observer of the hydrogen market. How would you describe the global situation as of today? Where do we see progress? Where do we see slowing down? Where did the market misses expectations? What is the situation today?
Let me give you a number. 8 out of 25. So that's 8 points out of 25 points that we gave the hydrogen sector in our most recent market outlook that we published at the end of last year. And we keep renewing that score every half a year. Half a year before that was 9. Half a year before that it was 11. So it's a low score with a slightly decreasing trend. Mm-hmm. And that's the overall picture for hydrogen right now, I would say. But there's definitely a lot of positives, which I'll talk about as well. So, but what's going on? Why do we give hydrogen right now such a low score? It's because the expectations have really not been met when it comes to demand. And demand is the main challenge that we right now see. There's a lot of suppliers out there who, if only somebody would kindly buy the hydrogen that they want to produce, they would build their projects and the sector would take off. But the demand isn't there. And why isn't demand there? Because costs are high, potentially higher than what people have expected before. And the policy that is needed to bridge the gap between the higher cost of production and the cost that's needed for users to accept the hydrogen is not or has not been moving as fast as possible. So that's the assessment that we have, and that's why the score is right now low in the market outlook that we've published recently. Now, where do we see the most progress? The next part of this question, it's exactly in the same places that have managed to pass some policies that would help scale up the market. So that's most obviously Europe on the demand side and also on the supply side. Mm-hmm. But as we know, some of the policies, I think we'll talk about that later as well today, have not been or have not met their expectations entirely. One place I think and I hope we'll get a chance to talk about today is China, where there hasn't been much policy until recently. And even then we actually saw a lot, and now there is a lot of policy in China, and there will probably be more, and we expect a lot to happen in China. And there are a couple other markets which we find quite interesting. India is one of them, some of the other exporting countries as well. And of course, there's the US, but the US right now is mostly a blue hydrogen market,
Hmm.
assuming the EU keeps ammonia and fertilizers in the CBAM, which I think we'll talk about as well.
Yeah, we can do that definitely. So let me just come back once again to this scoring of hydrogen, 8 out of 25. That sounds pretty low. Can you remember what the numbers have been in 2021, for example, when we all experienced there is a kind of hype in hydrogen? Did the numbers then reflect this hype also, or was it always a very realistic view on the hydrogen economy?
So we didn't actually have this scoring metric in 2021. So unfortunately, I cannot give you a concrete, definitive answer. But what I can say is that BNEF was more optimistic about hydrogen back then than it is now. But we were always saying uh, we should, or the sector should proceed with caution. And a lot of the use cases and a lot of the mega projects that were announced back between, say, 2019 and 2022, when really
Hmm.
the peak of the hype was happening, we were back then cautioning that many of these don't have off takers. The sectors they're proposing that will be the off takers don't really make much sense for hydrogen. And a lot of the projects that were announced will surely have to be revised or cancelled. So I would say
Hmm.
if I could go back and were asked what that score would have been, it would surely have been higher back then than it is today, but it would certainly not have been very, very high and reflecting a bubble, because we were aware we are in a bubble back
Hmm.
in 2019.
Martin, you mentioned the other day on LinkedIn that, as you have said now, the hydrogen forecasts have been probably too optimistic in the past. I would add from my side or our side that we today think that now some of the forecasts are very too pessimistic because, of course, some things are still going on. Um, which assumptions do you think are now more realistic than a few years ago? I mean, optimism is not only driven by facts, but also by policies and by hope and by whatever kind of expectations. And what's more realistic than a couple of years ago from your perspective?
I'm guessing you're leading me towards talking about electrolyzer costs and costs of renewables, which I think we
Yes,
could
for
also
example,
talk
yeah.
about. But I actually would prefer to stay on the topic of policy,
Hmm.
because that actually has been the one thing that has turned out to be the main factor in the forecast that we have being relatively low what it is today. About 5 million tons by 2030 is what we expect, blue plus green globally. And we hope we will not have to revise that down again. But so far, the trend in our forecasting to 2030 has been that every forecast we've had to revise
Hmm.
down so far. Now, why has that been? It's because the policies that we expected and hoped would scale up the market have not either not happened or happened but more slowly, or they happened but there was so much uncertainty around them that they actually didn't have the impact that people would have expected, or that we would have expected, and that we were assuming for the market. So to give you concrete examples, uh, in the EU, of course, you've got lots of today, lots of agreements, lots of arguments around the definition of RFMBO, the EU shorthand for green or renewable hydrogen, and the derivatives of it, which I think is slowing down some developers. Certainly, if you're a developer in um, Europe, but also outside of Europe, looking to sell to Europe, you're going to be very cautious if you're not sure that the EU will not actually change its definition of
Mhm.
green hydrogen
Mhm.
in 2026, which we're actually thinking is quite a realistic possibility that that might happen. There's been a lot of calls for that to happen from certain parts of the hydrogen industry. And if the EU does change these rules, then we think the rules will probably change no matter what by 2028 when the EU has to make a review. But can they change sooner? And if they do, what would that mean? And everybody's waiting for that, and that's been slowing down some of the development. So that's one thing. Another, of course, is the RED three, the targets for using this renewable hydrogen, which have to be implemented on a member state level in Europe, and that has been going more slowly than many would have imagined. And even the same markets that have actually passed RFMBO are not necessarily, sorry, RED 3 are not necessarily likely to actually meet those targets. And I can give you one concrete example. I live in the Czech Republic, which was one of the first member states of the EU to pass the RED 3 targets, which I was surprised myself to hear when that happened, and I certainly wouldn't have bet on my country to be one of the first. But when you talk to people here, you still there's not that many companies that would actually have to meet those quotas. And when you speak to them, uh, they all tell you the same. They say, you know what, we're just going to wait. If we have to pay a fine, it's probably still lower than the cost of us trying to obtain this green hydrogen, especially given we cannot buy, say, electricity from Poland because that's not the same region, would not meet the regional correlation criteria. People think, for sometimes for good reason, that renewables are expensive in this country, and so I would actually not bet on Czech Republic to meet the RED 3 quotas, even though they've actually been legislated, which is one of the few member states so far that have done that. So that's another thing. And now you've got wavering on the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism as well, which came into force on the 1st of January. And on the 7th of January, there was a press conference by three commissioners and one minister saying they might actually exclude fertilizers and ammonia from the CBAM. If that happens, in our view, that kills the business case for blue hydrogen, which EU is not really keen on using blue hydrogen, at least officially. But in practice, the CBAM was a mechanism to enable imports, that would have helped make a business case for imports from places like the US of blue ammonia. If this is taken off the table, that's a lot of projects, or a lot of, not that many projects, but a lot of hydrogen, a lot of ammonia that would probably not be built. So these are just a couple of examples of policies. And you've got the US, where the 45V, 45Q credits were passed, but people were waiting for so long for the guidance on what constitutes renewable, just like here in the EU, the rules turned out to be quite similar. But by the time the rules were announced, it was 2 weeks or 3 weeks before President Biden handed over to President Trump, and then everybody was still waiting to see what happens with a new president in the U.S., which turned out to have been probably wise, because he passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the OBBBA, which has shortened the application window for green hydrogen projects, and that has, in our view, mostly killed the industry, the green hydrogen
Mm.
industry in the US. There's a couple projects that will still happen, but not that many. So who would have guessed 3 years ago, if we made our forecast, we thought, there you go, the US clearly is going to be a leader, and Europe clearly is going to be a leader, at least when it comes to the offtake. But these things aren't happening as fast. And you've got Korea, which has just canceled its auction for importing ammonia and hydrogen, and will probably replace it with another one. Maybe they'll switch from focusing on blue towards focusing on green. But that all of these things mean that the policies you thought were going to drive the market aren't actually working as you had hoped. So that's a long story, um, But that's the view that we have on the market. Policy is most important, and it's not coming through.
It's a very important story, I think. I agree. It's a long story. It's a complicated story, and I will come back to it. But let me first make the statement that we, as we are working with a lot of startups in hydrogen, a lot of very innovative companies, we strongly believe that definitely we do not have a technical problem and we do not have a technological issue. We have a political challenge. We have a regulatory challenge. I totally agree. And depending on these two challenges, we have an investment challenge, because investment, of course, has policies, has regulations, has perspectives in mind. So this all is very close connected to each other. But let me just come back to the situation. I'm kind of glad that you said you do not have you didn't have the scoring system a couple of years ago, because I'm really convinced the situation is now totally different. And policies on energies not only depend on the energy situation, but nowadays, of course, they depend on geopolitical situations. They depend on the ongoing war in Ukraine. They depend on the supply of energy in general. And last but not least, coming from Germany and having a view on the European Union, it also, of course, depends on the economic situation in general. So I totally agree. We have one challenge, that policies that have been decided are not implemented fast enough because of the probably even individual economic challenges in different EU countries. And the other thing is that due to the geopolitical situation, I think that many policies are being discussed, if not even revised, because of the changing environment in the world. And you mentioned the US. I agree. A couple of years ago, there was a huge impact of the IRA, of the policies in the US on the global energy topics. And now we are a little bit afraid that the attitude towards green energies, blue hydrogen, and everything that's not coal or gas-based fuels is really impacting the global situation as well. So US is one thing, but you mentioned China, and I would also to add India probably to the discussion, because this seems to be kind of a hidden champion for me, especially when we are focusing on ammonia. And probably the German Chancellor brought back some good news from India. We'll see. But looking at China, because the US it's really a complicated topic at the moment, I think. What about China and its role in the global hydrogen economy? Some people even say it could be a role model because they are moving quite fast. But can it really be a role model for an economy like the European economy, comparing the two systems? What do you think about the situation in China?
China is fascinating because it's already by far the biggest market for green or renewable hydrogen. Their definition of it might be slightly different, but electrolytic hydrogen made largely from renewables, they're certainly a leader, both in the volumes of production and in the volume of projects being announced and having been actually completed, and also in the production of electrolyzers. And that's despite China actually not having really had a very strong or clear policy for green hydrogen. It was actually quite cautious in the hydrogen strategy that they released. They were cautioning against building too much. I think they kind of sensed that this could be a bubble and wanted to wait a little bit. So we were quite surprised when we started seeing this flurry of policies that were announced starting around the summer of last year in China, that were all very specifically targeted to scale up the green hydrogen market. China is now asking some of its state-owned companies to start building projects and to start using hydrogen. The whole demand problem, they're they can force it basically. It's a bit easier that way in China with lots of state-owned companies. They're asking provinces to start building green hydrogen projects as well. A couple other policies they've passed, and now most recently, the hydrogen was included among one of several technologies with to focus on in the 15th five-year plan that they'll be approving later this year in March, I think. With the other technologies were things like nuclear fusion, quantum computing, and hydrogen. So clearly, China is now very serious, and if this five-year plan passes with hydrogen in it, we would reasonably expect to see even more hydrogen focus in China going forward. So China is really fascinating, and I think China is probably going to be one of the leaders. Can global other countries be inspired by what China is doing or how China is doing things? Like you're saying, it's a different model. The the fact that you've got all these state-owned companies in China means that it's basically China's way of subsidizing. It doesn't sound like a subsidy if you tell a state-owned company you must build at least 100 megawatts of electrolyzers, at least 100 kilometers of pipelines, etc. But it really is a subsidy because the state-owned company is going to build it. They might lose money on it, but they know that they're not going to go bust because the state will save them if the need arises. Whereas that's not necessarily the case with most of the other developers in most of the other countries where they have to justify spending to their shareholders and meet their internal rates of return, etc., which makes it much harder to make large investments like that. The other part is China makes really, really cheap electrolyzers. Some of it has to do with the really cheap inputs that they've got in China, very cheap nickel and labor that helps them assemble stacks that are much cheaper. I'm not sure there's that much to learn though from that in the West because we've done the math. We've looked at how much would it cost, or how much would you save on hydrogen if you were to import an electrolyzer from China. Turns out actually not that much because the stack and the importable parts are only a small part, no, say 1/5 of the cost of the level of the entire system. So if you save 2/3 on 1/5, it's not actually that much money you're saving, and you're introducing some possible risks into your project, which need to be reflected in other costs potentially rising, like your contingencies. So then your levelized cost of hydrogen actually doesn't fall that much. So on electrolyzers, I think the thing that Europeans can do is just keep making technology that's reliable, that's good, that sells, uh, and and try to compete with the Chinese that way.
That's thank you so much for the clarification because I just wanted to ask you what impact does the big Chinese market for hydrogen, for electrolyzing capacities, for manufacturing could have on the European, on the global level. And it's interesting to hear that the impact is not so big, but the topic, of course, is also a topic that is related to European politics and policies because resilience and sovereignty and independency are really interesting factors at the moment, and we have a very lively discussion. We also had it here on our podcast about the role of European electrolyzing capacities and companies and dependencies from China in this respect. And it's great to hear that the impact is there, but not as big as people always think. And this brings me back to a question that many assumptions and many discussions about the hydrogen economy are not based on facts and figures, but assumptions and general views on how the world is turning. So it's great to hear that there is something going on in China. And what I think people can learn is it's of course not to adopt the system and to copy something, but what I really think is an interesting point in China, that the Chinese government is deciding there's not only one way for the energy transition and for renewable energies, but it's many ways, like building like power plants, conventional power plants and renewables, and investing in hydrogen. The same with the traffic, investing in e-mobility, in combustion technologies and in hydrogen mobility. This is, of course, something that maybe we cannot learn because costs are more important in our system, obviously, than in China. But interesting enough. So I agree. A role is not a role model, but it's a very interesting market to observe in order to not miss out what's going on while we are still discussing very few projects and very few and everybody is discussing it. We will not meet the goals if we continue in the pace that we have now. From the technology side, you mentioned electrolyzers and the capacity in this respect. To the offtake side, Europe is an interesting partner for many partners, for many countries in the world as an offtaker. But don't you think the same observations apply to the offtake thing than to the regulation and production? Too much reluctance in the market, or what would be your analysis about the offtake in Europe?
Yeah, offtake in Europe depends on the policies. I think we've already talked about those, the RED 3 being the most important one, but you've got the maritime and aviation regulations as well, which also could, and certainly in the case of aviation, should be leading to some adoption of RFMBO.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that we are now potentially seeing the RED 3 not being implemented, as I've said, on time. Um, that's of course worrying. Aviation also a little worrying, because that the aviation regulation actually is really interesting, because that's the one regulation that's enforced on the European level, not by member states. So it's not 27 different member states have to pass it on their own. It's already passed, and there is a pretty strict penalty as well, which in theory should actually be driving imports or production or use of this RFMBO in aviation. And even there, we're actually hearing from airlines, from their fuel suppliers, that they're kind of waiting. You know, the fuel suppliers are waiting. So they're thinking, if we don't supply it to the airlines, we're just going to charge them the fine that we get that we have to pay anyway. So we don't have to worry. Everybody's kind of waiting and hedging, even though there actually is a very strict, penalty and lobbying against it. So I think you're right. We're in a very different world now than we were 5 or 10 years ago, when it seemed like even though we were not going to reach 1.5, we were surely aiming for 2, and hydrogen was going to play a big role there. Now it seems like you've got a lot of pushback from pretty much every industry that's asked to use hydrogen.
I see the same things, and because of the impact that the actual situation has on policies, and so I would like to mention two things that could bring some hope, even optimism to the thing, that are all things connected to artificial intelligence and data centers. Yesterday, I read in the German financial newspaper that hydrogen stocks are rising, kind of, because the prospects of electrolyzers in connection with data centers and decentralized energy production. And the same applies for, or the same goes for all things connected to defense tech and defense strategies, because we have this very interesting discussion in Europe, in Germany and Europe, about how to become independent from fuel, from energy, from electricity, and and how to make use of the opportunities that the amount of renewable energy produced in Europe is not so bad. It's not as big as we have planned and expected, but it's not so bad. So it would be possible. So what's your take on these two factors? Is this really a reason for optimism, or is it a new thing or two new ways to look into, or is this also a kind of hype and it is more wishful thinking than reality?
Yeah, so I know that I've sounded very pessimistic throughout this conversation so far. So you're trying to get me to say optimistic things. So please remind me to do that, because I do have a couple optimistic messages as well. But I'm afraid I will disappoint you on the data center side, where we are aware of some stocks going up quite significantly as a result of the AI industry or AI hype. One of them, I can probably give you an example, is Bloom Energy, which is a producer of fuel cells. Now, the one thing to be cautious there about is the reason this Bloom Energy stock is going up is not because of hydrogen. It's going up because there is a very big shortage of electricity in the US to supply data centers. The cheapest way to do that is today with gas fired power stations, typically using turbines. But the waiting time for turbines, the last time I checked, is at least 7 years or something like that. So if you're facing this situation and you're in the industry, AI industry, you believe that this thing is happening, and I don't really have a view on how big is the bubble, and is this going to collapse, or are we actually going to see AGI? And it's different people would have much better views on that than I do, or more informed views. But what I am seeing is this need for electricity perceived from the buyers, and if they cannot get their turbines, what's the next thing they're going to do? They're going to look for other things. So of course, they're looking for nuclear, etc. But they're looking at fuel cells. And what are these fuel cells going to do? They're going to not use hydrogen. They're going to use natural gas, just like the turbines. So they're going to pay a bit more for the fuel cell than they would pay for the turbine, but they're going to still run it with good old natural gas. And the fact they've bought a fuel cell, I think the additional bonus point there is that they can pretend like one day they will actually use some hydrogen and decarbonize their data centers that way, which I think is probably unrealistic on a large scale, but on a small scale, yes. The one thing I have, though, noticed is a lot of there's a lot of news out there that the green hydrogen projects that have been canceled are giving or selling their grid connection to data centers. So that's one way in which it's a very cynical view. It's one way in which hydrogen can be helpful in data centers. Of course, you can power data centers. You can use hydrogen for backup if you want green backup. It makes sense to potentially consider things like hydrogen run by fuel cells. But I personally do not think this is going to be a big industry. On defense, I think there's some potential business case to be made, or case to be made, but I think we also have to be real. If I'm no defense analyst, but I do come from the part of Europe that used to be behind the Iron Curtain before 1989, and I'm well aware of the potential threats we're facing from Russia, and I would be surprised if any army was seriously considering to run on hydrogen. Maybe a small unit or a small portion, yes, but not the entire enterprise, because we're talking survival here, and that's the first thing that matters. And unfortunately, but it's true, survival from climate change is much farther away, or a thing that we need to worry about much later than current survival from a potential attack. So if we're going to see defense companies producing new weapons and technologies, I would be surprised if much of it were running on hydrogen, simply from these practical considerations.
I definitely agree, and we'll have a next episode especially talking about defense tech and energy strategies. But I agree in general that the use of hydrogen-powered tanks or drones or whatever will take some time at least, and as you said, it's basically now about survival and winning, and we do not have the time to wait for this. But on the other hand, just to mention that we have a very big defense tech company in Germany investing now in electrolyzer production. So and since those people can really calculate and know how to invest their money, there's something to it. But be curious about it and listen to the next episode. But coming back, Martin, to our talk, you said probably you sounded a little bit pessimistic, and you announced there are some optimistic views on the hydrogen economy as well. Let us close the episode with this optimistic view on things that are going to happen or that are happening already. What are those optimistic perspectives?
Yeah, so a couple optimistic points. The first optimistic point I have is we think this year is going to see 2026, we're going to see a record number of a record volume of installations of clean hydrogen projects. We expect about 900,000 tons, so almost a million tons of green and blue hydrogen being commissioned, or production what being commissioned this year. It's about 2/3 blue and 1/3 green. 2/3 blue because blue projects are really large. It's really just 4 blue hydrogen projects, but they two of them in the Netherlands, one of them in the US. They're very large. So if they get the commission, of course, that suddenly you've got hundreds of thousands of tons just from that. Then the rest is green, where we're seeing lots in China, but a large volume also in Europe. So this is going to be a year where we are going to see record installations. So that's my positive message number one. Positive message number two is I think there's some other markets other than Europe that are going to start picking up the pace. You've mentioned India. We're personally really excited about India, and we saw the recent announcement by Uniper and AM Green that Uniper is going to be buying a large volume of I think 500,000 tons per year of ammonia. We're not certain about the cost and the duration of the contract, but this seems like a very optimistic message that India can supply cheap ammonia, cheap hydrogen to the rest of the world. And hopefully, and this is my third message, also at home, because a lot of the exporters that you have, and that's a problem of many of the exporting or would be exporting countries, is they're looking all at the same 2 or 3 markets. It's the EU, Japan, and Korea, and that's pretty much it. And if these don't go ahead with the policies as we've discussed, as fast as and as effectively as one would hope, then what are these producers going to do? They're going to have to close shop when they run out of funding. Or their domestic governments can also walk the talk and support some domestic demand at home, even though the general strategy is to export. And that's what we are seeing in India, where there were 13 auctions for domestic use of green ammonia in fertilizer production. Very low prices were announced. What we aren't sure about is how many of the winners will actually end up signing binding offtake agreements and coming online. We hope as many of them as possible, because that would show the world that India is serious also at home. And India isn't the only market like this. We're seeing other exporting markets looking into demand side policies. Chile is one, where they've passed demand side tax credits through the lower house, but they need to pass through the upper house and be signed by the president. And the thing is that Chile just had elections. They elected a new president, which who may potentially not want to sign into law, or may have some questions. And that the president José Antonio Cast, he comes in March. So if the law gets passed by March, then Chile will have demand side tax credits, which would be quite exciting in our view. It would not be a huge market, but it would still show Chile is serious not just to export but also to use this. And the same goes for Oman, which has said that they would be doing some demand side incentives at home while they wait for the global market to pick up. And I think we'll need to see, and that those will be the most successful exporting markets that keep their developers, or at least some of their developers, busy with producing hydrogen at home, learning, getting that experience, learning from their mistakes. And when the time comes, when Europe comes back and says, "Now we've passed RED III, now we're clear on our policies," they can start signing offtake agreements much more easily because they will have track record. They will be able to serve the market more easily.
Great, and in addition to that, one can only hope that Europe is focusing the lead market strategy that is like lobbied for and discussed for quite a long time now. For example, refineries could be a very good example. Obviously, steel industry is complicated, but at least refineries and those already dealing with hydrogen, with gray hydrogen, could be an interesting market. Well, that's kind of optimistic what you said in your last remarks. So and it just an important point I always see is that we have to take the global perspective. Like if you just look at Germany, Europe, or single countries in the European Union, it's probably not as optimistic as it is when you consider countries, you named them, Chile or Oman or India or China or others. The global perspective is, I think, less pessimistic than it appears at the moment the European discussion is. So Martin, I could go on and on with you because you really give valuable insights. You have the data, which is the value of BloombergNEF. We as H2 Hub, of course, value this partnership also because it gives us real good insight into what's going on. And let me thank you for today that you took the time to talk about the situation of the hydrogen economy in 26 with us. You gave some optimistic views. We'll have a focus on the things that need to be addressed on the policy side. So thank you very much. You showed us where we stand and gave us even a hint where we could stand when we look back in 11 months on the year 26 and see what it has brought for the hydrogen economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Uwe.
And for all of you that are listening, that was Let's Talk Hydrogen again. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe to the podcast, share it with your network, and tune in next time. Thank you very much.